All right, good afternoon, everyone. If I can ask our moderator and panelists to come on camera, we're going to get started here. All right, so thank you all again for joining us this afternoon on what's a cold and rainy day. If you're in Chicago, we're grateful for the opportunity to gather virtually today. My name's Sarah Frick, and I'm the Chief External Relations Officer for the Family Institute at Northwestern University. And we are here today to learn how to learn new ways to connect and reconnect with our loved ones. For those of you that may be new to the Family Institute at Northwestern University, our organization, through therapy, education, and research, is one of the nation's leading relationship-based behavioral health organizations committed to strengthening families and strengthening and healing families. We provide services across all life stages for families, individuals, couples, children, and adolescents. Our moderator for this afternoon is Tamara Faulkner. Tamara is a licensed clinical social worker and certified drug and alcohol counselor. She is also the director of couple services at the Family Institute. I want to welcome our two panelists for this afternoon. Rebecca Coopersmith is a licensed clinical social worker and certified sexuality educator and staff therapist at the Family Institute. And Leah Fishbein is a licensed marriage and family therapist and a staff therapist at the Family Institute. Many of you have submitted questions in advance of this discussion, so we will get to those at the end of our discussion. And with that, I will turn it over to Tamara to get us started.
Thank you, Sarah. And thank you, Leah and Rebecca. I'm really looking forward for us connecting today. And I wanted to speak to all of the participants that unfortunately we're not able to see, to congratulate you on taking a step in connection. Just to further incentivize and reward you, I wanted to share with you a quote from the Social Connection as a Public Health Issue. This is something that came out in 2022 from the Annual Review of Public Health that said something in very austere language, that the converging evidence has documented the effects on mental, cognitive, and physical health, on their outcomes with the strongest existence, demonstrating the association with the risk for premature mortality. As you all may know, it came out in The Atlantic, it was summarized last month. Robert Waldinger and Mark Schultz produced the results of the longest study on human happiness. And in the course of describing that, they cited this particular statistic, that ongoing loneliness raises a person's odds of death by 26% in any given year. Furthermore, in 2020, Stephen Porges, who is the preeminent author and possibly the coiner of the phrase polyvagal theory, put it down this way in the article, "The COVID-19 pandemic is a paradoxical challenge to our nervous system, that there is a biological imperative of connecting with others to feel calm and safe." So I wanted to start today by acknowledging that most of us are experiencing the consequence of that paradox. We have been sequestered with one another, not out of choice, in a lockdown that on one hand, we are surrounded by people that we are supposed to be feeling comfortable and connected and safe with, but surrounded in a community that tells us that other people are not safe. And those signs come up in the form of masks or in the terms of dichotomies within our kind of political spheres. So we're getting conflicting messages about how safe one another is and how much we can depend on one another. So today, as we go in, I'm looking forward to a really fruitful conversation to talk about connection and disconnection and how there can be benefit in normalizing both of those and really committing to the path of connection. So Rebecca and Leah, let's get this started by maybe giving us a sense of why you see connection as important in both your practice and also your personal work. Rebecca.
Yeah, thanks. I think, you're so right. And the work of Stephen Porges really highlights all of this, that connection's a basic need. Just to say it so simply, this is something that we all need. And it can be connection to other people. It can be connection to ourselves, or it really, I think connection to places is really important too. And a lot of people who I speak to talk about needing roots as well.
Hmm.
And you're exactly right that during the pandemic, our connections in all ways have been completely upended. And when we lose this balance of connection, we can see particularly anxiety, we can see depression, and it also can really impact sexual health as well.
Leah.
I think very simply put, the quality of our relationships determines the quality of our life. The Greek root for the apocalypse is the uncovering. And I think that's what the pandemic did for a lot of people. When we are outside the context of normalcy, what is revealed to ourselves about what is important. And I think for a lot of people, it was their relationship to themselves and their other. When everything else is stripped away, what is the essence that brings about well-being?
And one of the things that is so powerful is seeing how the distillation process of the pandemic has brought forth something that they could see in the very beginning of that 80-year-old study, is that when it comes to what's important to people, every 2 years they would reflect, these 734 men would reflect on what was important. And consistently, even though obviously the social circumstances that existed 80 years ago are not the same as now, they would find that people would take that time to reflect on the quality of their relationships. So here we are, and we're investing in that. And I think a great place to start is, how do we know we're there? What does connection feel like? What shows up for us? What do you think, Rebecca?
If I jump in first to just kind of provide an overview of kind of a reconceptualization of connection. I think, like, if we're thinking about the word itself, the etymology of connect is to bind together. So when people hear this word, they think of avenues for connection, the what, the how. So think date nights, questions to ask on a first date, sharing a hobby with family members. And I think it's important to kind of have a shift of perspective, to turn attention to not the avenues for connecting to objects, but the quality of those objects, the foundation of those objects that you are connecting, which is all to say that in order to be connected to someone else, your ability to do that is predicated upon your ability to be connected to yourself first. And we need to look inward at the solidity of our own foundation before we can look outwards in how to connect to others. And if we think of this literally, if you were trying to connect two objects, it is way easier to bind them if those objects are solid rather than connecting to amorphous things. So if I'm aware of what's going on within me, if I'm solid in that foundation, it's going to be easier to connect to you in a genuine, sustainable way. Dr. Gabor Mate provides a really helpful framework to understand this. Both of you are naming the primal needs that we have for connection, which is our need for attachment, our need to connect to others. And sometimes that can compete with this other primal need we have, which is authenticity, which is our ability to connect to ourselves. Looking at that primal need for attachment, connection to others, we are a species that are interdependent and we need each other for survival. You think about a baby being the most vulnerable creature there is. It's entirely dependent on its parents for survival. And one can also think of our origins in hunter-gatherer societies where we lived in interdependent communities that relied on one another for our basic needs. So our survival as species depends on our ability to connect. And then there's this sometimes competing need, which is authenticity, our need to connect to ourselves. It's the ability to be attuned to our bodies and our emotions and listen to what they are signaling to us about our needs. If you think of an animal in the wild, if it isn't in touch with its fear, doesn't know when to run, it dies. It's a pretty extreme example, but I also think something more common, interacting with an infant, illustrates this perfectly. They are so inherently attuned to their gut feelings, their need for hunger, their need for sleep, and their ability to communicate that in a really primal way. An infant isn't socialized out of listening to its body and its emotions. It's always connected to itself. And we can think about these two sometimes competing needs on a spectrum: attachment, connection to others; authenticity, connection to ourselves. And in my mind, relational health is somewhere in the middle. It answers the question, how can I stay connected to myself while also staying connected to you? And I think the chief task of any relationship is navigating difference so that one can be connected to themselves and others simultaneously. And I think at the core of a lot of couples therapy is really making explicit the implicit ways that we've navigated those things our entire life. Attachment research shows that our experiences starting in infancy of relationship deeply impact how we see the world, how we see others, how we see ourselves. And because children are completely dependent on their parents, they always will give a primacy to attachment over authenticity. They know who they need to be in that family unit to get their needs met, what emotions are okay to show, what interest is okay to show, how it is okay to interact with others. And these ideas, these schemas, this invisible template becomes a template for how they navigate other relationships, and it colors how they show up, which is to say that how we were loved impacts how we do love. And I think as adults, a lot of the work that I do in my couples therapy work is teaching how to unlearn the compromises that we've made as children. And that starts with connecting to ourselves before we can connect to another.
Rebecca, I wanted to know, so what I appreciate from what I'm hearing, Leah, is the idea of this potential tension, and yet so important to try and come to a state of flexibility and also openness regarding the relationship to self and the relationship to other. And also, I think it's great, Rebecca, I was thinking about you and your work as kind of within sex education. I'm thinking about the biology of many of these things, but also in terms of connection. I don't know if that's where you were thinking of going with this, but that's an area that I couldn't help but think about you.
Yeah. And first of all, Leah, I think you brought up so many really good points. I think one of the most important things that you said is really about our connection to ourselves. And, we all work as couples therapists. And I think for a lot of folks, they have the sense, I want to be as close to someone as I can. But sometimes it's those differences that can keep things really fresh, and to have kind of this space within oneself to relate to other with is really one of the things that makes relationships work really well. But to get back to your actual question, Tamara, I don't want to miss that. Talking about sexual health, sometimes sexual health can be kind of a bellwether in relationships or just in general, that when something is going wrong sexually, that can be a sign that there's something else going on, whether it's a mental health issue or it's a disconnect in relationships. So it's really kind of important for folks to kind of keep that at the forefront of their mind, what is going on. And couples often can use sex and sexuality as a way to connect with each other. And then this can really kind of be a double whammy in a way, that if couples are feeling disconnected, they stop having sex, but that's something that keeps them connected. So it kind of accelerates a disconnection. And kind of one of the other issues that I see coming up with couples in general is communication, that a lot of people feel like communication can really be a barrier and why people aren't feeling connected or connecting in the way that they want to connect. And this is also actually very related to sexual health too, that when couples talk about sex, particularly with enough frequency and quality in what they're actually describing, this helps couples' relationships overall.
You know, you're bringing up something that's so important that I will be discussing. And first of all, I wanted to let everybody know who's here on our call that we're going to be talking about couples, and then we're going to be opening up a bit to talk about other relationships as well. Because the feeling safe with others, seeing others as our co-regulators in that sense of safety is not just about that intimate partner that we hopefully are able to have sex with, and we hope it's good sex too. I wanted to talk about communication and to talk about communication as it manifests itself both physically and in words and other forms, by also considering the powerful role of expectation. And this goes a little bit to what you were describing, Leah. One of the things that I found most powerful in the research that I was doing about loneliness was it was describing loneliness as a discrepancy between what I had expected from a connection and what I'm getting in a connection. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about talking. What have you found is in your work is the kind of talking that is useful for folks, the ways that you have found this idea of connecting. Sometimes we don't want to connect on negative things. We only want to connect on positive things. But what have you observed, or what would you recommend that people, when they want to connect verbally, what are some kind of cues that you might suggest, or things that they might look for?
I can start. People come to therapy because connection's off. And I think a typical presentation, most couples, when they come in, they say that they want, when I ask, like, okay, 6 months down the line, if you're getting at what you want from therapy, like, how will your life look different? And most people answer saying, I want the other person in the room to change. These problems would be solved if my partner were X, Y, and Z. Without an awareness of what they're contributing to the dynamic within the relationship. And I think building off of what Rebecca was naming around how that manifests in physical intimacy, in a typical heteronormative presentation, that might be one partner saying, I want more physical connection, I need more sex in my life, and the other partner saying, I need more emotional connection, and the other one saying, I need you to give me this before I'm willing to feel connected enough to give you that. And they get stuck in this pattern, and they come in framing their needs as oppositional and conflict with one another, and in reality they are both hurt and hungry. And in that frame of authenticity and attachment, they are rigidifying in their authenticity and using attachment as their leverage. And speaking of how this manifests in other relationships, I see it a lot in the adult-child-parent relationships that I work with, of a child saying, I can't be me, I can't be myself with you, and therefore I'm creating distance. And I think relational therapy is about realizing the mutuality of those influence and the way that that mutuality strengthens our connection. Our partners, in whatever form that is, they aren't static entities that exist within a bubble uninfluenced by you. Your partner always exists within a dynamic with you. And it's why we are different with different people, our colleagues, our friends, our families. So your partner is completely different with their friends at work. And when things go right or wrong with our partners, we need to be able to ask ourselves, what part of me is bringing out this part of them?
So Rebecca, I see you nodding.
I am. Yeah, I think, Leah, you just bring up so many good points. And kind of top of mind is, couples coming in, or anyone wanting someone else to change. And I think I've said probably to literally every client I've worked with, and yet they keep coming back, that you can only change yourself. You can't change your partner. You can't change the people around you. But I think you're right that these patterns happen. And it's really hard to, when you're in it, it's hard to know what's going on. And I think people can have a sense of stuckness without realizing what the pattern is, that they're just kind of in it and it doesn't feel good. And what I end up seeing very often with couples mostly, but this can happen really in any relationship, is kind of like a pursue withdraw. That one person can really kind of pursue something from the other in some kind of way that the other person can't hear it. And then when they feel pursued in this way, it brings up a part of their self, like you were saying, Leah. And maybe they try and communicate with their partner what's happening. Oftentimes they're communicating it again in a way their partner can't hear it. And then they withdraw. And it creates this kind of self-perpetuating cycle about pursue and withdraw. And it can be hard. It can be really hard for people who are in it, and people can really feel disconnected.
So what I appreciate about that is, and both of you are speaking to a level of kind of awareness and of observation that we see a lot in kind of mindfulness work going on now, the idea of how do I observe this? And one of the things that I'm sensing is a kind of common element in this is how do I observe what it is that I need, what it is that I'm looking for. And I'm so upset that I can't give you a proper citation for this, but in the great wisdom of some sitcom I watched someplace, one of the characters said that parents are always looking for their children to say thank you, and children are always looking for their parents to say I'm sorry. And what I was thinking about is the idea that the want. It sounds like one of the things that we're talking about, going to your concept of authenticity, Leah, is the idea of how do I know what my want is? And maybe to extend something that I imagine sex would be a place for you to talk about this, Rebecca, is curiosity. How do I extend that curiosity to my want rather than a judgment to it? But so it's a lot of work with me before I go to you. What do you guys think of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's so easy for folks when they're in whatever kind of cycle. And actually, what I hear you saying, Tamara, is something I see very often, that, you know, one person just kind of wants to be heard and the other just kind of wants appreciation. And I find that very, very commonly. And I think I'm losing sight of what your question might have actually been.
No, not at all. Not at all.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
I was just going to say that connection to our, like you're asking kind of like where do I know this information is coming from? What does connection within myself feel like? And I really think it starts with connection to our body, that people come in saying, you know, this is an issue of mental health, and I will start with their physical health. How are you treating your body? Are you treating it well enough that you can be in tune with it? Are you exercising? Are you nourishing it? Are you engaging in mindfulness of some sort? Because once you can tune into your body, it becomes a source of data. Your emotions give you data. There's this false dichotomy between the emotional and the rational, but our emotions are data points that guide us towards health, and all emotions have an action tendency. We talked about that animal accessing its fear and knowing it needs to run. If we're able to feel the sadness by like the heaviness in our chest, sadness needs soothing, interest needs exploration, anger needs boundaries, disgust needs distance, and contentment needs savoring. So I think a helpful tell of connection is like, how connected am I to my body? Can I register where my emotions are living within it? And can I act on that information once I receive it?
That's a
And if I
great,
can,
yeah,
I'm
please
sorry.
do, Rebecca.
Yeah, if I can just add to that, as the sex educator perspective, if one doesn't know what they're needing in their own body, what feels safe in their body sexually, what doesn't feel safe, trying to communicate or convey that to somebody else is not going to work very well.
And so when we're going to safety, and kind of the internal sense of it, Leah, I wanted to know, you have an image that you have brought forth that you were going to share with us that I think really speaks to kind of what that internal situation may feel like, what that yearning to connect, and even that loneliness could feel like. Do you feel comfortable? Sarah, do you think you could cue that up for us?
This piece is titled Love, and it was created by Ukrainian artist Alexander Milov for Burning Man. And I show this image a lot in the couples work I do, because I think it beautifully captures what it is, what it feels like to be disconnected. You see these inner children, which are the parts of us, the vulnerable parts of us that are soft and tender, and that for a lot of people are hard to bring into relational spaces because of the way we've been socialized around our emotions. So the adult kind of shown in this image as these exoskeletons are what we do to protect the vulnerability within us. And often how we protect that is really contradictory to what that part of us truly needs for connection. And sometimes it's even a matter, going back to what we were saying about being able to register things in our bodies, it's sometimes we don't even have access to that vulnerability because we are so used to operating from that protective stance, from this exoskeleton. Yeah, I just think it beautifully captures what rupture and disconnection feels like. And again, going to the elements that we need to connect to first before we can connect to one another.
If only we could see that clearly, and how much we wish that those that we love and care for could see our inner needs, or our inner, even child selves, how much they could present themselves. One of the things I want to talk about is I wanted to see if we could shift to the idea of disconnection, and disconnection that represents something that isn't necessarily unhealthy, that the beautiful image that we just saw of love recognizes that is one moment in the relationship, and what we're looking for is the opportunity to turn towards. So how do we know when we're in a place of disconnection and rupture? And then how do we know when we can use that as an opportunity, as the Gottmans have taught us, to bring further intimacy? What do you guys think?
I can dive in on that. And I think I just want to ground us that within any relationship, friendship, family, romantic relationships, disconnections happen. That there are times that we feel more connected to people, and there are times that we feel less connected to people. And this is normal. I call them chapters. But sometimes what becomes really problematic is the things that we do when we are feeling disconnected and the ways that we respond and react. And this is where, Tamara, I think you were saying Gottman's work comes in. And sometimes when folks are feeling, this disconnect, instead of staying with the vulnerability of it and saying, I'm sad, I miss you, I want to connect with you, it feels safer to dive into some other behaviors. And the ones we kind of commonly see are criticism, contempt, defensiveness, and stonewalling. And these can kind of become very dug in positions for folks.
Yeah.
Yeah, those 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, as the Gottman calls it.
Yeah.
The exoskeletons of that image of how we turn away to protect that softer vulnerability within us. And in terms of honoring that softer vulnerability, Terry Real came out with a book earlier this year called Us, and in it he uses this really helpful metaphor as relationships as biosphere. That relationship isn't something we are above, they are something that we are in. They are the home in which we reside, and you can pollute that biosphere with these 4 horsemen that Rebecca are naming, in the form of anger, in the form of resentment. But ultimately, your contributions to that biosphere, that toxicity that you spew out, you will eventually breathe back in by the other horsemen that your partner will take on, of withdraw, of content. And I think moving in a stance where we can honor each other's vulnerabilities is acknowledging our interdependence, of viewing your partner's well-being not separate from your own well-being, because within that biosphere, what happens to you happens to me, which then in turn happens to you, and round we go. And I think the shift of relational accountability is asking yourself, what do I need to do differently to get the relationship I want? It's looking at what you are contributing to that biosphere rather than asking your partner to change.
Yeah, I think you've, again, I feel like a broken record. You have so many good points. And that, part of, when ruptures happen, when disconnect happens, I think you're kind of getting at that we have to kind of grapple with what it is that we may have done that may have inadvertently hurt the people that we care about. And kind of going back to where we started with self, I think sometimes it's easier to grapple with this when we understand what part of self that this has come from, and how this might have served oneself when they were younger, getting back to that attachment versus authenticity. Maybe this behavior came about because this was something that someone learned to protect attachment. So these kinds of behaviors that people do that can cause harm, they come from somewhere. And having that self and working on self can make it a little bit easier to reconnect with folks.
So one of the things that I'm thinking of that I really appreciate is the idea that investing in our relationship is investing in ourselves. It's kind of like this is a moment to recognize that climate change is real in a way, right? Like we are all in this. And one of the things, again, to talk about regarding Gottman is the idea, and I think any of us know this, and back to the baby, that whole biological co-regulation of Porges shows up when someone I care about is in a state of distress and is suffering, I suffer. And so it can continue over and over. And yet one of the dynamics I think that we see in our work with individuals and couples and families is sometimes it seems that we have 2 channels, which is either shame or blame. So when we're talking about doing that internal sense of what is my part in this, I do think it's useful to talk about how do you guys cope with that kind of dichotomy, right? Of it's either my fault or their fault. That seems to be part of that sense of self that needs to be protected and feel safe, and that it ends up costing us more. How do you guys suggest that we cope with that as individuals?
Building off of what Rebecca was sharing, of like, there's somewhere along the line, we learned that this is how we needed to show up. This was our adaptive child. And that makes sense. And we can have compassion for how you learned that. And at the same time, we can hold you lovingly accountable that what was once adaptive in a particular context is maladaptive in this context. And we can extend empathy to this while also extending accountability in the same breath. But I think people get dropped into shame when it's, I didn't do a bad thing, it's I'm a bad person, which then causes them to rigidify because they're feeling attacked, they're feeling unseen. So if you can get them to soften, if you can acknowledge that hurt inner child that is driving this behavior, you can kind of lodge a ball over the wall that they're building over their anger, which is really what they want, which is acknowledgement. Can you see me and love me? Because couples come in extremely hurt, and that hurt is also a factor of their love. You wouldn't have the ability to hurt me if I didn't deeply care, if I didn't want this to work. So we have to dig through those defenses to get to the source of this, which is love and care, that they were doing the best with what they have at the time. And sometimes it's inefficient, and sometimes you need a perspective change, but can we come at this lovingly?
I like working with shame, actually, for a lot of reasons. But sometimes I compare shame to a mushroom, which I know sounds often left field. But the more you don't talk about it, and the more you keep it in the dark, the more that it grows. So when it comes to shame, to me, it's a matter of, bringing it into the light, because that immediately kind of weakens the shame, but also kind of accepting and having compassion, maybe even eventually loving that part of self that has that shame and that has developed that shame from somewhere. And kind of going back to your initial point, Tamara, about shame and blame, I wonder if sometimes the shame really kind of fuels the blame, that it's it's just so hard to sit in shame. It's easier to go into blame.
Right. And to get to that place where I can recognize that I'm doing that. And it is a survival technique to want to unload that. I don't want to sit in this feeling, and it's paradoxically healthy that I want to unload this. It's just that it's great if we can get to that place where we're compassionate towards both of those things, and we can change the channel to recognize we have greater capacity. So let's go back to that concept of the rupture. I'm looking to connect after a rupture. How do I know I'm in a place of rupture? Just some pragmatic stuff that you would want folks to know about when they know they're in a place of rupture. And then what are some first steps that you can imagine, or even some images you might suggest that would help people understand ways that would feel safe to go about repair, and thus potentially building an even stronger, more attuned relationship? Who wants to go first?
Leah, do you want to go first on this one?
I think of knowing where we are in the spectrum of rupture and repair. A lot of it is, I think, asking yourselves, do I have access to the part of me and my partner that I enjoy the most? Am I noticing that I'm operating from those defenses and not acting out my values and the best part of me? I think that's a really good tell of asking yourself, do I like who I am with this person? Am I able to show up in a way that's aligned with my values with them? And also, just as importantly, do my differences between me and this person, does that feel threatening to me? Do I feel like I have to be a particular person to protect myself, to protect them? I think that's a sign that you don't have access to the best parts of yourselves, and you're not going to have access to whoever it is that you're trying to connect with.
That's great. So the concept of, do I like me right now? That sounds like a really good place to start. And the idea of how do we allow for differences? And I'd like to be able to circle back to that with you in just a minute. Rebecca, what do you think? How do I know I'm in a rupture?
Yeah, I mean, I think we feel it in our bodies. I think just in our guts and our hearts, something just feels off. And I think it can be as simple as that. Something doesn't feel right. It doesn't have to be something we cognitively understand. We can just kind of sit with the bodily sensation. I do think sometimes what can be a little bit problematic for folks is that, they can kind of they can think something feels off, it may be something kind of within oneself that they think could be within a couple. So for instance, someone's needs not being met fully. And well, if someone's needs aren't met, it's really important for that person to figure out, oh, what is it I need to do to meet my needs? But sometimes they kind of look to others to meet the needs when it doesn't necessarily have to be. And that can be a little slippery.
So what I'm hearing is that sense of your body showing up first. And I don't know about you guys, it's a matter of gut clenching, shoulders tightening, jaw clenching. Sometimes it's useful, I find, to taste what our mouth tastes like. Does my mouth taste like metal? Then I've got stress hormones going on and I should know that. That's just good information. But kind of the serve yourself first too, which is, so this is my body. Whoa, this is my body. I'm stressed. What is it that my body is needing and what can I do? While being kind to that fact that we really do want somebody to fix that for us. That's okay, but start with us first. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah. That
makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Relational tell too, that I often will see in the therapy room, which is of course another, I'm in relationship with my clients, is a tell to me that I am misattuned and I'm causing some rupture in our relationship is when a client will keep on saying the same thing, but slightly differently. And to me, that's a tell. Like it might feel like, okay, they're digging their heels in, but to me, that's a sign that I'm missing something, that they are not feeling understood. Because if they did, the conversation would have progressed somewhere else. But the fact that they keep on alerting my eyes back to something is to tell me, you are not seeing me in this moment as an opportunity that something's going on with me, maybe that's stopping me from being present with them in that moment. And what do I need to do to show up in a way to be of service to them? Which I think goes into how therapy can be healing, because you are in a relationship with your therapist. And I often view my relationship with my clients as an avenue for healing, as a safe ground where they can show we can navigate rupture differently. Okay, I upset you, tell me about that. And I normalize that of like, if this goes well, there's going to be a time where I'm going to say something that feels misattuned, or you're going to feel misunderstood. You're going to feel like I might be aligning with your partner. And I would hope that you would feel comfortable enough to bring it to this space that you can have a different example of what navigating difference looks like, and modeling relational accountability of like, yeah, I can see how you could feel misunderstood by me in that moment.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Rebecca, I don't mean to make you the person who only talks about sex, because there's many more things you can talk about. But I couldn't help wonder, before we turn to other questions, misattunement in sex can be pretty fraught. And so what have you found is useful for people to be able to go to when there's been a rupture in that particularly important, vulnerable space?
Yeah, that's a particularly hard topic for folks to talk about when it happens, because people have so much meaning tied up into it that they think they're, less of a whatever because something isn't quite going right. And I generally say, we have to be honest that something's not going right. I think I've seen folks try and avoid this type of conversation for all the obvious reasons. And that makes things kind of get worse, actually. So I really kind of highly recommend to folks, this is something that does need to be talked about. Don't talk about it like in bed when, when something has gone sideways. That is not a recommendation, but talk about it when you two are kind of in a more regulated place, and, try and be really understanding, try and understand the other person's viewpoint, where they're coming from, how they might feel in these moments.
And boy, I really appreciate that, Rebecca. And I think one of the things that came to my mind was to incentivize. is that there's been some great work. Her name is, I think, Irene Moss, and she was talking about striving and happiness and contentedness. And one of the studies that they found is that couples that are able to talk about unpleasant things have a greater capacity for the pleasant things in their relationship.
Yeah.
So we can't, once we stretch this way, it helps us stretch this way, and we can allow for this, and then we can have more of that. So I can tell you that I like this much more easily if I can tell you that I don't like this.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's, to your point, it's kind of straightforward. If we don't, talk about this and have those rough conversations, it won't get better. And it does impact the overall health of the relationship.
Yeah. Well, thank you both. Is there anything we want to talk about before we move to answering some of Sarah's questions? Great. Well, thank you. Sarah, let her rip.
All right, thank you. And thank you all for this wonderful conversation. As I mentioned before we got started, participants submitted questions in advance. And while we received many questions, there were also a lot of themes that we gathered from these questions. So we'll get started with some of those. There were some questions around connecting with siblings in particular that are perceived as controlling within the sibling dynamic, and that sibling will only connect on the terms that work for them. What advice would you give to the sibling who's trying to reconnect to that other sibling?
Yeah, Leah, this sounds like a fences question.
Yeah, Mona Fishbein has this metaphor of boundaries that typically when we think of boundaries, we think of distance, and offering a reframe that if we think of a boundary like a fence, that fence it creates a line and it does keep some things out, but that fence can also be designed to keep things, to invite things in. So you might want the fence, the slats between it close enough so that their dog doesn't come in, but you might want it low enough so you could see the beautiful maple wood that they have on the other side. You might want a door on that fence so that you can sometimes go in between. So reframing a boundaries of, I'm asserting this space so that I can connect to you in a way that feels good, and I can take the good and leave the rest. An example from my own life, I have some family members who have very different political views from me. But for me, connecting to family is still important. So I have the boundaries set in our relationship as such that we don't talk about politics, we don't talk about current events, and we find avenues for connection through our mutuality of interests with cooking and dry humor and travel and adventure. And that is the way that I can stay connected to these family members without abandoning my authenticity, that I can move towards my value of connection with family while also not straying from my own values around certain things.
It's a really helpful analogy of the fence, Leah. Thank you. And thank you for sharing your personal perspective too. Rebecca, do you want to share anything on that?
Yeah, I think this is kind of a tricky question actually, because, it's tough that family members have either kind of explicitly or implicitly kind of set a bit of a boundary. There's a fence there. And I think, the question is, can this person accept the boundary the way it is and accept, the siblings and the relationship based on how things are, or not? And both of these outcomes are okay, but that's kind of the framing, is this okay the way it is?
Mm-hmm.
And I would add one thing that I think is so useful about that is recognizing that so many of these things which come up and feel like hard fences are actually the fence for now. So really just milking the heck out of that one. So I may erect a 10-foot fence that only has this amount of opening because that's what I need right now to feel safe. But that doesn't mean that I can't change my fence. But maybe this is all that I feel safe to do now. So to allow yourselves just that inner message of this is what I need for now. This is what they need for now. That none of those fences need to be made of concrete and drilled down to the core of the earth. It's okay to have temporary fences that we can change as we feel a greater sense of safety.
I think
That's
that's such a beautiful point, Tamara, that the sign of health within relationships is being able to be flexible enough to adapt to the context, the moment, the time, and that boundaries are unhealthy when they're rigid, when they don't have enough sway to adapt to their environment.
Yeah.
That's really helpful. I'm going to pivot to a question that we got another theme around when someone's trying to connect with a spouse who is presenting as depressed, but isn't necessarily willing to seek help for that. What advice would you give?
I can jump in on that one. And, you know, it's a tough situation because everyone's kind of hurting in that regard. And my heart just kind of goes out to everyone. But, you know, I think the thing to do is, you know, show that you're there for the person and take care of yourself. And kind of getting back to a little bit of what I was saying earlier, be careful about kind of going into these more defensive stances while one's hurting, and to try and shift away from that.
That's helpful,
Yeah.
Rebecca. Thank you. Go ahead, Leah.
Research shows that connection is one of the most effective treatments for depression, and as such, couples therapy can be just as effective as individual therapy for the treatment of depression. So that could be one avenue to explore in terms of openness to healing in different forms. And Rebecca's point of self-care, it's also looking at what's going on in me when my partner's depressed that makes it hard to be with them. What are the stories I'm telling myself about this? And depression often leaves people with the internalized belief that they are being a burden, that they aren't capable of feeling connected. And as when we see someone we love in pain, it is evocative, and we want to lift that and we want to lighten that. But sometimes in our effort to prematurely go in and fix, to take it away, that can deepen the disconnect, because the person says, in the simplicity of the tool that you are handing me, you are not seeing the complexity of the problem. And I think people often underestimate the power of just being with, of listening, of asking more questions rather than stating more statements, of just really being with as a container to hold.
And Leah, I wanted to add to that. I was listening to something, and again, I'm hideous for not being able to attribute it to the right person. First of all, acknowledging the consequence to self when loved one is experiencing depression. Lisa Gordon did a beautiful webinar talking about a CBT kind of approach for couples with depression that really described the dynamic that can exist. But I heard something really lovely in a very different context about someone whose good friend was experiencing depression that was not about the verbal. And they talked about it, the fact that they would visit this person maybe once a week, and they would, now it's got a biblical vibe to it, so beware, they would wash their feet. And the reason why I loved this is because the being with does not have to be verbal. The being with can be sitting down next to you and watching the dumbest television show imaginable and just talking about how dumb it is. That can be, that might not feel like healthy. But you know what? It is showing the person that I am here with you. My body is here with you. Let yourself co-regulate in this way, but understand when you start to feel the heaviness too much that you may need to get up off the couch. That's okay. But taking that moment to be with that person is priceless.
These are really helpful tips for people to carry with them. Another question that we got was around if you're trying to reconnect with someone, but you're still holding on to that resentment that you have about something that's happened in the past, but you do want to connect with them. Any advice on that front?
Rebecca, go ahead, jump. Leah, sorry, jump.
Go for it, Rebecca.
Okay, I'm going for it. So it sounds like to me, when I hear that, the word that comes to mind is stuck. And it, that might be a good reason to try out therapy and to try and understand where some of that stuckness and some of that resentment is coming from. And I think, there could be any number of causes, any number of outcomes, but it's really important to kind of befriend a little bit of that, that resentment, just to understand it better. And I think the more, you try and push against the resentment and ignore it and not engage with it, the worse it gets.
I think I would also add that I hear in the question that there's something that isn't working, and yet you still want to be able to be connected to this person on some way. The wound hasn't been healed at its source, but that you still want a relationship, or you might still need a relationship with this person. And I think changing the tenor of a relationship can come in a multitude of ways. Sometimes it is fixing the wound, but sometimes it's not just decreasing the negatives, it's increasing the positives in your relationship. The Gottman show that for every negative statement you say to a person, you need 5 positive statements to counterbalance that one negative. So changing the tenor is also making deposits in your relational bank, so to speak. Going back to that biosphere relationship, it is asking yourself, even when things are awry, what can I do to nurture our environment, and not discounting the little things. Sometimes nurturing your environment can be putting down your phone the minute your partner, your child, your friend asks you a question, to subtly communicate, you are my priority in this moment. It can be saying what often goes unsaid of, thanks for picking up the dry cleaning, or to your child, I really appreciate that you prioritize this time with me. It's finding those little moments, because it's those little things we do a lot that really matter more than the big things we do every once in a while.
I just want to recognize the beautiful the connections between the things that both of you were saying. You're both, because it's befriending all of it. Because as you were describing, and Leah, thank you for that very specific put the phone down thing. But befriending self too, because maybe sometimes in order to befriend that resentment, we need to put the phone down to do that for ourselves too. And the idea that with that attitude of I'm befriending my resentment, I am much more likely to be warm and open to be able to see the positive in the other person. So if I can see that in myself, I'm more likely to be able to see it in someone else as well. So those are both great.
Thanks.
And then with our final moment together, our last question is around communication. And Leah, you sort of touched on this a little bit earlier around what advice would you give on how to break repetitive communication habits that don't lead to resolution?
I think an important part is to know when to pause. Just because you started a conversation does not mean you have to finish it. When you are in a productive space, when people keep on saying the same things over and over again, put a pin in it, come back to it. You need a minimum, if you're emotionally dysregulated, you need a minimum of 20 minutes for your prefrontal cortex to come back online to be able to enter the conversation in a cool way. And you also need to listen to hear and not to respond. Take the third perspective in this and be aware that the listener's job is to help the speaker speak, and the speaker's job is to help the listener listen. Another thing that I think is important in communication is taking a minute to look for the desire within the conflict. That often when we're operating from those exoskeletons, we see the exoskeleton, we see the defensive posturing, we see the scar, and we do not see the wound. So many couples come in talking about dishes, and it's never about the dishes. It's you not caring about what I care about. It is you not seeing that luminescent inner child within me. So ask yourself, when I'm having this conversation that is rapidly devolving, what part of my partner am I engaging with? And with, I see the scar, can I speak to the wound?
I know that we're over time, so I'm going to be really, really brief. But Leah, what you're describing, I call an adult timeout. Take a breather to try and just regulate, understand what's going on. Remind yourself that this is a person I care about. And sometimes try doing the opposite, see how it goes.
Yeah. But adult timeout means not yet, and that's just fine.
Thank you all so much for this really wonderful conversation over the past hour. I think we've all learned so much, and I want to thank our attendees for being with us today. Again, this recording will be emailed out to everyone and can be found on our website. And you can view additional events on our website as well for our future Circle of Knowledge events. So thank you all again for joining us, and have a great rest of your week.
Thank you.
Thanks.
And thank you, Leah and Rebecca.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.